Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We were saddened to learn prior to airing our show that our guest, Barbara Anderson, with whom we had recorded this interview, passed away at age 73. Barbara was the executive director of Citizens for Limited Taxation, whose legendary Massachusetts tax revolt 3 decades ago reverberates in the Bay State to this day. We present this program in her memory with our condolences to friends and family. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Bill.
Barbara, it's been 35 years since you led the fight in Massachusetts to pass Proposition 2.5, putting limits on property taxes. And given that this was a statute and not an amendment to the state constitution, it's sort of amazing that tax and spend politicians haven't managed to repeal it after all these years. I asked you on the show to refresh our memories about this historic battle and maybe look ahead to what kind of policy fights we can expect in the years ahead. First, take us back. Take us back to 1980, when the Citizens for Limited Taxation began its crusade. Remind us what the economic and political climate was like at that time.
Gee, if I go back to 1980, can I stay there? Life was simple then. We thought we were up against it, but back then it was conservatives versus liberals. It was taxes versus limited taxes. Mm-hmm. And we thought we were in the major battle of our lives. We were fighting the League of Women Voters. I mean, there was nothing to it. But at the time, it seemed very intense. We were following the lead of Howard Jarvis in California.
Right.
California had extraordinarily high property taxes, high assessments. Howard Jarvis decided to do a tax revolt. And in California, the easiest way to do it is with a constitutional amendment. So he went to move to change the Constitution in California. And that's complicated. They have to get a lot of signatures, but they have a lot of time to do it in. So we couldn't follow their format. We had the ability in Massachusetts that had been given to us by actually progressive liberals at the turn of the last century, because they wanted to get some control over the Yankees, the conservative Yankees who ran Massachusetts. So they created an initiative petition process for us. And the easiest way to do it here is with a statute, because you get the signatures, you go on the ballot. That's the end of it.
So it's the same thing as legislators passing a law, except it's citizens passing a law.
Right. The legislators won't do it. You know, you lobby, you do your best, you make your arguments. They refuse to listen. And so you go out and get your signatures, and the question goes on the ballot, and the voters make the decision. Relatively easy. Of course, the downside of that is it's only a statute. So we're in California. Any attempt to change Proposition 13, as it was called out there, requires another constitutional amendment. But here, an act of the legislature could have repealed our initiative petition if it wanted to. The thing was, everybody knew that our property taxes, the highest in the country, had to be limited. Something had to be done. But as politicians, they didn't know how to do it. So when the voters stepped forward and went to all the trouble to get the signatures, and everyone ran their campaign against us, and it was us versus the legislature and the League of Women Voters and the teachers' unions and all the other unions. When we finally won, I think there was sort of a general relief that somebody had finally done something.
Somebody belled the cat.
Hey, yes, and they were no longer going home, after a legislative day and hearing from their neighbors or the dry cleaners or the grocery store, why are my property taxes going up again? Everyone was mad at them. It had been resolved. Now, one thing we did have going for us here that other states that have tried to do the same thing didn't have is we had a very young, high-technology industry coming out of Route 128 here. And these were the executives who actually had created their businesses. They're coming out of MIT, out of ULowell. And they didn't know they weren't supposed to be political, or they shouldn't offend people. So they weren't afraid, as most of the business community was, to get involved with a grassroots organization.
And remember, those were crazy times, having lived through that myself. The 70s was an era of rampant inflation. My first mortgage was 18%. Of course, the Reagan Revolution changed a lot of that, but I would imagine that Prop 2.5 finally got its teeth sunk in about the time a lot of other changes were taking place.
We were getting signatures during the Carter years, the end of the Carter years, the high inflation, the misery index, as they called it, in double digits, and people were fed up with a lot of things, hostages in Iran, And so the voters in November of 1980 had us on the ballot, and they had Ronald Reagan on the ballot. And the voters had had enough. So in Massachusetts, liberal Massachusetts, they elected Ronald Reagan, and they voted overwhelmingly for Prop 2.5. We won 59 to 41%.
Now, critics complain that Proposition 2.5 would gut spending on public education. How does current per-pupil public education spending in Massachusetts compare with spending back in the 70s and with other states today?
Well, actually, we did cut education because we had this weird thing in Massachusetts, hard to believe now, that when the education establishment, the school committee, wanted a certain amount of money, the town had to give it to them.
I think this was called School Committee Fiscal Autonomy or something
School
like that.
School Committee Fiscal Autonomy. Whatever they wanted, you had to give it to them.
I don't understand. So the school board doesn't pass taxes. They just demand money, and it's up to the town to give it?
Yeah, what we have in the East is a town meeting, and in the Northeast. So we actually have voters who go into their town halls and town auditoriums, and they pass the laws and pass the budget and things. And when they're presented with the police budget or the public works budget or something, they debate it and they decide whether they're going to give it to them or not. With the education establishment, they came in, the school committee came in and said, this is what we want, and the town meeting had to vote yes.
Or else what?
Or they went to court, and then they won damages.
Wow.
So if there was one department that had certainly been overfunded, it was the school department. And that was what our town administrators, our town selectmen, our finance committees, that's what they had their eye on. So the next year when the cuts had to be made because of Prop 2.5, that's where they went. So yes, a lot of education funding happened because that was where the money was.
But is somehow Massachusetts way behind, Mississippi or something? Or how do we fare in terms of school spending today across the country?
Oh, the school spending is still high, and the amount of taxation going to education is still high, and it's not doing any good for a system that doesn't. Well, actually, the thing that people should know about Massachusetts, that people are astonished to learn, is that we were one of the first states to have charter schools.
Right.
And that was passed at a time when they were trying to do education reform to make the system work a little better, and it was Democrats and Republicans together who said we've got to have reform, and they included charter schools, and it's still a battle, and there's a limit on how many charter schools you can have. But nevertheless, the battle goes on with our new governor, Charlie Baker. He's trying to lift the cap. Parents want choice. So we actually were one of the pioneers for the charter school movement here, partly because there's a limit on how much you can spend, and so you want to spend the money as efficiently as you can, and God knows charter schools are more efficient without the union involvement than the other public schools.
So after 35 years of Prop 2.5, how does the total per capita tax burden in Massachusetts today compare with the national average?
Well, we're about the fifth or sixth.
Highest.
Okay, but compared to first, all those years.
Yeah, but we're still Taxachusetts.
Yes, we are. We still have high taxes, and because we have an income tax and a sales tax and a property tax. And the thing that helps a little bit is being next door to New Hampshire with no income tax. And our type of businesses, our high-tech businesses, they can leave.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of understands that Prop 2.5 worked. It was a good thing. And there's really no inclination to kill it, even though they could overnight or make major changes in it. And when they do try to make a change, all I have to do is send a press release saying they're trying to kill Prop 2.5 because sometimes it's complicated, so why get into the weeds? And everyone comes running to our defense, and they settle down and they leave it alone because it works.
Although I understand they haven't tried to kill it, it does have an escape clause that allows municipalities to override the limits, but only if increases are supported by, I think it used to be a 2/3 majority, and they changed it to a simple majority. How often has this override feature been used? Oh,
it's used quite a bit. But actually, that's the thing that saves Prop 2.5. Because it's only a statute, as I've said, they can repeal it at any moment. But then your response to that is, gee, your local voters could vote to raise the taxes if they want to. They're the ones who voted for you, representative. Why don't you trust them to make the decision on the override? And there's no answer to that. So then everyone backs off, and the town gets handed an issue, we'd like to raise more money for this, or we'd like to build a firehouse or something, the voters go into the privacy of the voting booth, nothing at town meeting, and they vote, and sometimes they vote to allow more property tax revenues to be taken from them, and sometimes they vote no.
And that's called democracy, I think.
That's democracy. It's an override. It's the voters making the decisions, and the town government, which knows it has to depend upon those voters to maybe do an override someday, actually treats everybody a whole lot better than it used to when they went to meetings and got ignored. So the whole thing just kind of works. It's a safety net, but, it's the people doing their own business, and I think it's the way it should be.
Barbara, moving on from Prop 2.5, I've got to ask you about someone special in Boston's journalistic history. I was named the Warren Brooks Journalism Fellow some years ago, which actually led me to launch this show. I never knew Warren, but I understand you considered him a mentor of yours. Tell us about him.
Well, Warren was the creator of Proposition 2.5. He looked at Proposition 13, said, we have to do something like that here, but not exactly like that. So he did the computation as to what we could do that would be like Prop 13, fitting within our own budget structure. And he basically drafted Proposition 2.5.
There's an activist journalist for you, huh?
Yeah. Well, actually, I knew Warren writing letters to the editor to my local weekly. And then he ended up with a column in the Boston Herald, an economic column. And he became the brains behind the taxpayer movement. And then he moved to Washington, D.C. and just went on to become an inspiration to a lot of people. So, yes, I miss Warren, and congratulations to everybody who, of course, gets the Warren Brooks Award.
Massachusetts elected itself a Republican governor, which happens now and again. What do you make of our new governor, Charlie Baker?
Well, I've known Charlie since he was basically a kid. He worked for the High Technology Council right after Prop 2.5 passed. Being businessmen and high-tech guys, you can imagine this, they didn't know how to relate to the media. And so the media would call them. They needed a quick interview. They'd get ignored. They'd call me, please, they won't return my phone call. I said, look, you guys need a communications director. Someone has to return the media calls. So they hired young Charlie, and Charlie became, of course, the darling of the media here because he's just so real and personable and attractive. And that's where he kind of got started in working in politics. And even back then, everyone was talking about him as a future governor.
Wow.
And it was just a matter of time. Well, it's been too much time, I can tell you that right now. But finally, he ran and won this last election cycle.
I guess the honeymoon period is over now, and he's into the day-to-day. How's he doing?
He's doing great because it's the same situation that I described with Prop 2.5. Here are all these Democrats, and they knew that there were things wrong with this state and that the state was corrupt in many ways, that the bureaucracy is out of control, nothing works. And what were they going to do about it? They had a totally incompetent governor, Deval Patrick, friend of Obama. So when another grown-up showed up who actually has management plans, management ideas, they've been happy to cooperate.
Isn't that kind of the Mitt Romney story? And it's kind of the Massachusetts cyclical history. Every, fourth or fifth election, they bring in a Republican to clean up the mess.
Yes, to play the grown-up. People in this state, they were Democrats, their fathers were Democrats, everybody votes Democrat, going back to the Irish moving into Boston. And yet people seem to instinctively understand that if they're going to indulge in this and then continue to elect Democrats to the legislature, every couple of years they've got to elect a grown-up Republican to actually run the state. And that's what's kept us functioning. And at the moment, we're doing pretty well as a state. I don't worry about it much anymore. My grandchildren don't live here anyhow, so I am mostly concerned about the country. And I'm retired anyhow from Citizens for Limited Taxation. This is my last probably real official interview. And so I'm not terribly worried about the state. I am terribly worried, of course, about the direction of the country.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. And, of course, there's been a lot of upheavals during the current administration. You had a bit of a dalliance with the Tea Party movement along the way. How did that work out?
The Tea Party was, we felt so alone, we being the people. Where was everybody? We had these little taxpayer groups here, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, came all these people who hadn't been involved before and who understood that the greatest danger facing this country was the national debt. and they made an issue of it, and they banded together, and they affected the election. And still, in the areas where the Tea Party has kept control of itself, staying with the fiscal issues, they are still having an effect. And they elected people to go represent them in Congress, most of whom betrayed them. Meanwhile, another part of the Tea Party, of course, was siphoned off by the religious right, and that made them completely useless.
It doesn't play well in Massachusetts, that's for sure.
No, though our Greater Boston Tea Party and our Worcester area Tea Party, they stayed with the fiscal issues. They do a lot of seminars and get involved with politicians and campaigns. So the Tea Party is still very active. Certainly, I consider myself a Tea Party member. Our organization was the first to jump on the Tea Party bandwagon and welcome them to the taxpayer activist excitement. So here we are. But then suddenly, then this year everything fell apart. This year's insane. This year's crazy.
It seems to be the year for insurgents. The establishment's on the run everywhere. Let's start with the Republicans. What do you make of the current Republican primary fight?
Well, I'm an independent. I'm a libertarian by nature. And I left the Republican Party years ago because they were always fighting with each other. And if you were a Republican, you had to pick a faction. And then no one else would talk with you. So I realized as an independent, I could talk with everybody and get along with everybody on the fiscal issues and taxpayer issues on which Republicans are solid. Fine. So far, so good. Normally, by this time, I have had a bumper sticker on my car for 6 months for my candidate.
Yeah.
I honestly didn't know to the last minute what I was going to do, but I voted for Ted Cruz thinking a Cruz Kasich ticket would be nice.
Didn't you just moments ago come out against the narrow-mindedness of the evangelicals, and you gave your vote to Ted Cruz?
Well, I like to think that Ted Cruz is too smart to believe what he's saying. And yes, okay, I realize that's a problem in itself. But I realize that to win in the Republican primary, you have to pander to the socials. What else can you do? I don't know what you do. It's, you don't see me running. I wouldn't do it. But the temptation to vote for Trump, yes, it's there. I understand a lot of my friends, a lot of my really intelligent, high information friends, and my really political active friends who know what they're doing are supporting Trump. And I understand this. I get it. I get also why the Republican establishment doesn't like Trump and is worried about him. What I don't get is why the Republican establishment doesn't understand what I understand, what I get.
Which is?
Why people are doing it, why they're going for Trump. Because all they were going to offer them was Jeb Bush. And if they can't do better than that, then they get Trump and they're wandering around with this dazed look on their face like, what's happening?
Well, Jeb Bush did do the nation a great service by proving that you can't buy the nomination with PAC money.
Yeah, we learned a lot from Jeb Bush, and I felt bad for him, but I don't think he ever really wanted to run. And the idea of Bush versus Clinton, people didn't want that.
Yeah.
And the Democrats, same way. The Democrats have had enough. So there's revolt everywhere.
Speaking of the Democrats and having enough of Bushes and Clintons, what do you make of the meteoric campaign of Bernie Sanders and his promises of democratic socialism?
Well, I mean, the young people who like Bernie don't even know what socialism is. They like his authenticity, just like Republicans like Trump's authenticity, which is odd and changes from moment to moment.
Right.
But they like people who just say what they're thinking. Donald Trump did the nation a huge service by attacking the scourge of political correctness, which is what's killing our country. He taught all the other candidates you can say whatever you darn well think. You don't have to apologize every minute. You don't have to backtrack on everything. And I think we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. But when you get to the point where I actually had to vote for him, I just
couldn't get there, huh?
Because I'm looking down the road and my friends say Trump is the future, and I'm thinking, yes, but when we get to that future, we are either going to be saying, wow, or, oh, crap, what have we done?
One or the other.
And I don't know which is which. It goes either way. So I thought, Cruz, I think Cruz has been set up to, everyone's saying he's unlikable. If I had run as a Tea Party candidate, which I would have done if I were young and felt like running for something, there would have been 2 people in the U.S. Senate that everybody didn't like. There would have been 2 people standing there saying, I'm not raising the debt ceiling, and I don't care what you do. I ran on that platform, and I'm not breaking my word. And so they've decided to demonize him and make him seem unlikable when the people who don't like him are people who are embarrassed because they aren't him.
His oratory can get pretty out there. But then again, so can Bernie Sanders. Do you think Bernie has a shot against Hillary?
I can't follow the Democrats, so I really don't know. It depends upon how attached people are to the idea of a Clinton, and I don't understand how Democrats think.
So in the possible event that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders totally scramble the Republican and Democratic parties' entrenched leadership, could that lead to some maybe reforms in our dysfunctional two-party system?
Oh, I think it could lead to a broken convention. I don't think the Democrats are going to allow Bernie Sanders, an aging socialist, communist even, to be their party standard bearer.
And I don't think.
And the Republicans could very well try to block Trump, in which case we'll have a revolution, and that'll be interesting. But people are talking now again, shouldn't we go back to the smoke-filled rooms? No, there was a reason we got away from the smoke-filled rooms. But, you know the joke, two Corinthians walked into a bar.
Yeah.
That's the joke. 2 Corinthians walked into a bar, and that's about my answer to almost everything. That was, remember, Trump trying to be evangelical, so he was trying to quote the Bible. He didn't know don't say 2 Corinthians, right. You have to say 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, got it. Sorry.
And so they immediately made it into this joke, 2 Corinthians walked into a bar, period. And that's my answer to almost any serious question, because there are no serious answers to these crazy questions in this crazy time.
So, Barbara, wrapping up, let's come back to taxes, and I'll ask you a hypothetical. I'm a retired venture capitalist. My wife is a doctor. Things are so crazy here in the Boston market. We couldn't afford to buy the condo we live in today, and we've done the math and come to the conclusion that we can't afford to retire in Massachusetts because the real estate taxes are too high. If we can't afford to retire here, who can?
Well, old people like me who bought our homes in 1974 for $34,000 before the real estate market took off, as long as nothing happens to Prop 2.5, and that's why I stay involved even though I'm retired, I can afford to live here on Social Security because I don't have a mortgage. Young people trying to buy in the market, I don't know how they do it either. They're looking at Tennessee. They're looking at states that don't even have an income tax. They're looking at Nevada, Washington State. There's no real reason to be here unless you just like, variation in your climate.
So, Barbara, what are you optimistic about?
I think this election, where people have finally stood up and said, we've had enough of the establishment, fix things. And they've said it both as Democrats and Republicans. This is the election where somebody might win who can fix things. It may be the last one, our last chance. Maybe our founding fathers, when they said, I'm giving you a republic if you can keep it. Maybe they knew what was coming. I think they'd be delighted we lasted as long as we did. But I still think we have one election in us that we can turn things around.
Well, let's hope your forecast is right, Barbara. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Anytime.
That was the last interview given by Barbara Anderson, who helped found the Citizens for Limited Taxation prior to her untimely passing from acute leukemia. Our condolences go out to Barbara's family and friends and to all those who fought by her side on behalf of Massachusetts taxpayers. I'm your host, Bill Frezza, and you're listening to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearmarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.net. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.